Hi, Nigel Morris here, and I want to discuss post-traumatic stress disorder, and with particular reference to how coaching and some of the techniques used in coaching can help improve the quality of life of someone suffering from it. I'm going to use Coleridge's poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner to demonstrate the clinical features of the disorder. The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. This has got to be one of the most famous opening lines of all time, written by LP Hartley in his 1950s novel The Go-Between. It's about a young boy's summer holiday in Norfolk where he's taken by a school friend. He stays at the friend's family home with the family. The narrator, as an older man, discovers a contemporaneous diary that triggers reflections on half-remembered events where he is unwittingly used as a messenger to facilitate an illicit affair. He reflects back on these events and tries to make sense of them. It is clear from the start that these events had a far-reaching effect on his life. So the concept of past life events being able to exert an influence on the here and now, and possibly on the future, is well documented throughout literature. Although the events depicted in LP Hartley's novel are upsetting for the boy, and later the man, they wouldn't fall into the category of trauma. The events depicted in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner would fall into the category of trauma. So before we go on to that, let's just have a think about what post-traumatic stress disorder is. It develops following a traumatic incident where there has been a threat to a person's life. And then following this, the event is re-experienced via three main subgroupings of symptoms. There is intrusion, and this includes intrusive memories, nightmares, and dissociation. These are flashbacks where the space-time continuum is interrupted for the sufferer. This is where they see themselves back in the event. Then there's avoidance, where the sufferer will avoid anything that will remind them and trigger intrusive memories. And hyperarousal. So this is anger, irritability, and the physiological symptoms of fight or flight, again when psychological triggers or cues are encountered. So let's have a look at the mariner's narrative and see how that fits with the diagnostic criteria as just discussed. So for those who are unfamiliar with the story of the Ancient Mariner, let me give a brief synopsis. It's about a doomed voyage. The mariner is the sole survivor of that voyage, and a series of disasters befall the ship and crew. They encounter a storm that blows them off course, and they are becalmed, and at this point they are dying of thirst. The mariner is held responsible by the crew because he shot and killed an albatross, and this was thought to have brought bad luck. As a punishment, the mariner is forced to wear the bird around his neck. Eventually they encounter a ghost ship. There are two figures on the deck of the ghost ship. Death in the form of the Grim Reaper, and Death is playing cards with a gaunt, sickly looking young maiden who is referred to as Nightmare Death in Life. The literary metaphor needs no explanation. These two play cards for the souls of the crew on the mariner's ship, and Death wins all the souls of the crew except one, and that is the soul of the mariner. He is forced to witness his crewmates die one by one slowly. The mariner is helpless to do anything to save them, and the horrific facial expressions are etched into the mariner's memory to the point where they can't be expunged. So we have here a near-death experience. The mariner's life depends upon the chance fall of the cards, so he is fearful he may lose his own life, and then he witnesses the slow, agonizing death of those around him and is helpless to do anything. So when the ship returns to land again, the mariner is compelled to wander the length and breadth of the country, repeatedly telling the story to anybody he can force to listen. He inflicts it on those around him. This is his trauma narrative. This is his punishment to live out the trauma narrative. It totally dictates his life and what he does with his life. He is held captive by the events of the past, and this is his nightmare death in life. He is reliving it on a daily basis again and again and again. It defines him, and he's re-experiencing the feelings that he had during the actual events that he recounts. He's constantly reminded of the facial expressions of his crewmates, and is aware that he couldn't do anything to save them. And I suppose this is not unlike nurses and doctors working in hospitals during the pandemic. There is that special trauma experienced by those in emergency services, where they feel helpless and blame themselves for lives they cannot save. And this is how trauma plays out for the sufferer as a retrospective psychological construct. So by this, I mean you've got the event that triggers the physiological and biochemical reactions in the brain. The brain's plasticity is altered, which is an important scientific note. Now, we all experience our internal biochemical and physiological processes as a psychological construct. The brain constructs experiences into the psychological narrative that becomes our reality. So we all reconstruct the past. The corollary being that if we reconstruct the past, we can deconstruct it and reconstruct it in a more positive way. So, some of the behaviours that you may see in someone suffering from trauma. Now, I'm assuming that the victim of the traumatic events is working, and I'm presuming either emergency services, accident and emergency, or, as with the pandemic, in ITU and general ward settings in the hospital. So there's a drop in performance. People become more angry at work and at home, an increased use of alcohol. This often leads to discipline problems at work. People can't function as efficiently at work. They are late or take inordinate time off, which could then lead to discipline problems at work. Driving offences, especially if alcohol has been relied on to get people through, is prevalent. And as the efficacy of alcohol diminishes with time, then it's complemented with other substances that just help the sufferer to put the trauma out of their mind, that gives some respite. And of course you've got the avoidance behaviours, and again with alcohol, anger issues, domestic abuse is also a significant issue. And what we have is a breakdown of social network that not only inhibits recovery, but it compounds the initial trauma. And there is research out there that I won't reference specifically now, that suggests that people with a strong social network are able to maintain structure and are best placed to recover from a trauma afterwards. So, trauma is sometimes seen as a disease of time, as illustrated by the above quote by Alan Young, where he says The disorder's distinctive pathology is that it permits the past memory to relive itself in the present in the form of intrusive images, thoughts, and in the patient compulsion to replay old events. And this is what we see the ancient mariner doing. And again, there's further literary connection with this in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, where he says, "The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it." So again, there's this reflection on the past in a form of helplessness. Old events playing out in the present, this is where we see the mariner live out his trauma, the mariner's compulsion to replay old events. Now, whether he sees someone to inflict his narrative on or not, we assume that the narrative is going on continually in his head. We have to accept that the mariner's past is a done deal. We can't do anything about it. No therapy could ever eradicate the trauma memory or the traumatic event. What it can do is to realign your relationship with the trauma in order that it stops exerting such a negative influence on the present and ultimately the future. So, what can the individual do to help themselves? And this is where I think coaching is fundamental to helping. Firstly, we look at what we have control over. So the past is something that is troubling us, is exerting a huge influence on us, concerning us greatly. We accept that we have no power over that. We don't have a TARDIS that we can zip back to the point before the trauma. So what can we do now in order to get the best out of our lives? Again, it's simple. Now, I want to qualify the use of the word simple, because something is simple or a solution is simple, it doesn't mean it's always easy. Implementing these things is difficult for good reasons. There are barriers. In the case of trauma, there are psychological barriers that prevent doing these simple things. It still comes down to a choice at the end of the day. We have a choice whether to seek help. This may sound trite, and it is often difficult, because a person who suffers has got to make a choice whether they want to talk to a stranger, which could trigger their symptoms, or whether they want to carry on immersed in their own self-medicated Smirnoff therapy, which is not really very therapeutic. In the end, it contributes to another huge problem that is probably as bad, if not worse, than the initial trauma. So, having sought help, this is the inner circle. These are the things that will fall into that inner circle. So, having sought help, the next area of control is adhering to the treatment, whether that is psychological interventions such as talking therapies, or whether that is medical interventions such as antidepressants, which will reduce the symptoms of the trauma. It still comes down to a choice, and making right choices for you will help maintain your social network, which, as I've already cited, is a huge contributing factor to recovery. By choosing not to engage in behaviours that will sabotage your recovery, you're in the inner circle. You know, things are now controllable. As it expands, it gains more leverage, and social and occupational structure is maintained. So structure throughout work, relationships and hobbies, these are things that are hugely powerful in maintaining recovery. These are mechanisms of recovery. The American psychiatrist Harry Stack Sullivan believe that people's interactions with other people, especially significant others, that is family, determine their sense of security, their sense of self, and the dynamisms that motivate their behaviour. By paying attention to the previous points, we are maintaining very powerful means of recovery. I've mentioned before that Viktor Frankl always maintained that we have a choice. He accepts quite readily that we can't prevent acts of brute luck befalling us. No one has control over what happens to them. We can't control that. What we can control is how we choose to respond. In his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, he asks the questions, what has this experience taught me about myself? And I think this is a fundamental idea that has been taken up in the concept of trauma resilience and growth. People can reflect back on traumatic experience at the right time of recovery, and they're able to make some very important, or take some very important lessons about themselves. They are more positive than their initial untreated negative self-appraisal lets them believe. And here you see we are altering the brain's plasticity again. We are recreating the trauma image, and we are viewing it differently, and it all stems from focusing on the inner circle and making difficult choices that we have control over. And this will enable growth and resilience of the person. A lot of work has been done around this by Professor Stephen Joseph in his 2011 book What Doesn't Kill Us. And as Frankl cites, that trauma gives ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add deeper meaning to life. So by helping people reflect back on the trauma, they can take some positive lessons forward to the future. So the coach's role in all of this. The coach is effectively a set of eyes in the air. Thinking of the expression, you can't see the wood for the trees, and for people who are experiencing serious emotional turmoil, their ability to think clearly and to define a clear route through their experiences is inhibited by impaired thought processes. The coach has objectivity due to emotional distance. The coach is effectively able to rise above the individual's experiences in which they are mired, and can view the greater topography of the psychological landscape that the sufferer is trying to traverse. The coach can help the individual find a way through by asking questions that get them to reflect. And by reflection and teasing out their hidden strengths, the resilience, the individual is improved, and we can help them navigate across the topography to that spot over the horizon that they want to reach. So that's what we can do as coaches. By helping the client focus on the things that they are able to control and rediscover their strengths, it is possible to make a real difference to the quality of life in the here and now. It's not only PTSD, but other areas of life too. The terrible job or the awful relationship, that's social or occupational relationship, and that's just a couple of areas that spring to mind. These are things that are in the grasp of the individual to change. They just need time to calm down and start to think. I just say calm down, but what I mean is by that once the heat is taken out of trauma memories, or once the heat is taken out of any emotive situation, and fight or flight mode is subdued, we can then turn on the thinking part of the brain. By calming down, we bring the brain back online, and then exploring the trauma can provide a lot of positives in the form of character traits that have been overlooked, such as resilience, ability to act in a positive way under extreme circumstances, and that surely has got to be worth pursuing.